The river did not flow so much as it slithered, a heavy muscle of tea-colored water pushing through the prehistoric gaps of the Appalachian Range. It was the Susquehanna, a name that sounded like a sigh and felt like a threat. In the town of Wrightsville, where the skeleton of an old bridge still reached out like charred fingers into the mist, the water held a specific kind of silence. It was the silence of things swallowed and never spat back out. Elias sat on the edge of a rotting pier, his legs dangling over the churn. He was a man made of driftwood and nicotine, his skin creased by decades of sun that never seemed to get him warm. He watched the surface, looking for the V-shaped wake that didn't belong to a log or a wayward carp. The locals called it the Susquehanna seal, a name that sounded almost whimsical, like something from a children's book or a tourist postcard. But there were no postcards for what lived in the deep trenches near the Safe Harbor Dam. "You're looking for it again, aren't you, Elias?" The voice belonged to Miller, a younger man who still believed the river was just a resource, a thing to be measured in cubic feet per second and nitrogen levels. He stepped onto the pier, the wood groaning under his heavy boots. "It isn't a search if you know where it is," Elias replied without turning. His voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the rush of the water against the pilings. "It's more like a vigil. You don't look for the sun to rise, Miller. You just wait for it to happen." Miller leaned against a rusted bollard and spat into the river. "There aren't seals in the Susquehanna, Elias. It's too fresh, too shallow, and too far from the Atlantic. If it's anything, it's a stray manatee that got lost or a very confused sturgeon. People see what they want to see when the fog rolls in off the York County hills." Elias finally looked up, his eyes a clouded gray that matched the sky. "A manatee doesn't have shoulders, Miller. A manatee doesn't have eyes that reflect the light of a cigarette from 50 yards away. And a sturgeon doesn't take a full-grown buck off the bank in under 3 seconds without making a sound." The younger man laughed, but the sound was brittle. He looked out at the water, which seemed to darken as the sun dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the tree-line. The Susquehanna was wide here, nearly a mile across, filled with treacherous rocks and hidden shelves. It was a place where a secret could hide for a century and never feel crowded. "I saw the photo the boys at the bait shop were passing around," Miller said, trying to sound casual. "Just a dark shape. Could have been a tire. Could have been a ripple." Elias stood up slowly, his joints popping like dry kindling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth piece of bone. It wasn't white, it was stained a deep, earthy brown, polished by the grit of the riverbed. He handed it to Miller. "Found that in a washout near the bridge abutment after the spring floods," Elias said. "Take a look at the teeth marks." Miller held the bone up to the fading light. It was a segment of a deer's femur, snapped clean, but the surface was etched with deep, serrated grooves. They weren't the gnaw marks of a coyote or the crushing fractures of a snapping turtle. They were precise, curved, and deep. "Could be anything," Miller whispered, though his thumb traced the grooves with a sudden, involuntary tremor. Elias took the bone back and tucked it away. "It'd been here longer than the town," he said, turning his gaze back to the water. "My grandfather called it the water dog. The tribes before him had a different name, something that meant the one who breathes in the mud. Seal is just the word the newcomers used because they needed it to be something they understood. They needed it to be an animal, something with a Latin name and a place in a book. But the river doesn't care about names." A sudden ripple broke the surface 30 yards out. It wasn't the frantic splash of a fish or the steady wake of a beaver. It was a smooth, silent displacement of volume, a dark arc of slick skin that rose and fell in a heartbeat. It was larger than any seal Miller had ever seen in a zoo. It had a mass that felt industrial, a weight that seemed to pull the surrounding water toward it. "Did you see that?" Miller asked, his voice climbing an octave. Elias didn't move. He just watched as the wake headed toward the center of the river, moving against the current with an ease that was haunting. "It's moving toward the deep hole near the old bridge," Elias murmured. We should call someone, Miller said, reaching for his phone with fumbling fingers. The DNR, or the police. If there's something that big in the river, it's a hazard. People swim here, Elias. There's a boat ramp just a mile up. You call them, and what do you tell them? Elias asked, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. That you saw a shadow. That you're afraid of the water. They'll tell you to go home and sleep it off. The river takes what it takes, Miller. It always has. The mist began to thicken, rising from the water like steam. The far bank disappeared, leaving them in a world made only of gray wood and black water. From the darkness near the center of the river, a sound drifted back to them. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a long, low whistle, a sound that vibrated in the chest more than it registered in the ears. It sounded like air being forced through a narrow stone pipe, ancient and hollow. Miller stepped back from the edge of the pier. He felt a primal urge to be on higher ground, away from the dampness and the smell of silt. I'm going back to the truck, he said, not waiting for an answer. You're crazy for staying out here, Elias. There's nothing out there but cold water and bad luck. Elias didn't answer. He watched Miller retreat, the headlights of his truck eventually cutting through the fog as he sped away from the riverbank. Once the sound of the engine faded, the river seemed to reclaim its territory. The silence returned, heavier than before. Elias reached into his bag and pulled out a small, silver fish he'd caught earlier that afternoon. He walked to the very end of the pier, where the wood was green with algae and the water swirled in a treacherous eddy. He knelt down, ignoring the ache in his knees, and held the fish out over the surface. I know you're there, he whispered into the fog. I know you're tired of the noise. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the river against the stones. Then, slowly, the water beside the pier began to bulge. There was no splash, just a rising dome of water that broke to reveal a head. It was wide and flat, covered in skin that looked like wet slate. There were no visible ears, and the nostrils were mere slits that flared with a wet, huffing sound. But it was the eyes that held Elias. They were vast and dark, reflecting the faint ambient light of the town's distant street lamps. They weren't the eyes of a mindless predator. There was an intelligence there, a cold, calculating awareness that had survived the Industrial Revolution, the damming of the waters, and the poisoning of the runoff. It was the river itself, given form and hunger. Elias dropped the fish. The creature didn't snap at it. It let the fish hit the water and sink for a second before its head dipped beneath the surface with a fluid, terrifying grace. A moment later, a sleek, powerful tail slapped the surface, a sound like a gunshot echoing off the hills, and then it was gone. Elias stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers. He felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that comes from knowing the world is much larger and more mysterious than the maps suggest. He looked out into the gray void where the Susquehanna seal had vanished, knowing it would be back, just as the tide would turn and the fog would eventually lift. The town of Wrightsville slept on, unaware that in the dark heart of their river, something ancient was breathing, waiting for the next spring thaw to remind the world that some things can never be tamed. Elias turned and began the long walk back to his small, quiet house, his footsteps muffled by the damp earth, leaving the river to its secrets and its shadows. He didn't look back, for he knew that once the river gets into your blood, you never truly leave the water's edge. He walked until the sound of the rushing water was nothing more than a memory, a low hum in the back of his mind that would stay with him until his own time was swallowed by the deep. The mist clung to his jacket like a damp shroud as he reached the gravel road that led away from the pier. Behind him, the Susquehanna remained a restless, dark entity, its voice settling back into the low, rhythmic thrum of a predator at rest. Elias could still feel the vibration of that tail slap in the marrow of his bones, a physical reminder that the boundaries between the known world and the deep were thinner than most men dared to admit. He thought of Miller, safely tucked behind a steering wheel, likely convincing himself that the bone was a fluke and the shadow was a trick of the light. It was a mercy, Elias supposed, to be able to lie to oneself with such conviction. He reached his small cottage, a structure that looked as though it had been assembled from the river's own refuse, and paused on the porch. The air here smelled of wood smoke and damp cedar. He pulled the piece of etched bone from his pocket one last time, turning it over in his calloused palm. In the porch light, the serrated grooves looked even more deliberate, a testament to a mouth designed for the heavy lifting of survival. He placed the bone on a small side table next to a collection of smooth river stones and rusted iron spikes salvaged from the old bridge. Inside, the house was silent save for the ticking of a grandfather clock that hadn't kept the right time since the flood of '72. Elias didn't turn on the lamps. He moved through the gloom with the practiced ease of a man who lived by the moon's schedule. He poured himself a glass of water from the tap, tasting the faint, metallic tang of the local aquifer, and sat by the window that faced the valley. From this height, the river was nothing more than a black ribbon cutting through the fog, a void in the middle of the landscape. He wondered how many others were out there tonight, sitting on different piers or hiding in the tall grass of the islands, waiting for a glimpse of something they couldn't name. He knew he wasn't the only one who kept the vigil, though the circle was shrinking every year. The old-timers were dying off, taking their stories of the water dog to the grave, replaced by people like Miller who looked at the water and saw only a chemical composition or a weekend playground. A low creak moved through the floorboards as the house settled against the evening chill. Elias closed his eyes and let his head rest against the back of the chair. In his mind's eye, he saw those dark, vast eyes rising from the silt, ancient and unblinking. It was a heavy burden, carrying the weight of a secret that the rest of the world had forgotten, but there was a certain dignity in it. He was a witness to the things that refused to be categorized, a keeper of the gray spaces where the maps ended. The river would rise again in the spring, fueled by the melting snows of the north, and it would bring more than just mud and debris. It would bring the hunger back to the shallows. Elias knew he would be there to meet it, just as he had been for 60 years. He finished his water and set the glass down, the sound echoing softly in the empty room. As sleep began to pull at him, the sound of the distant water seemed to grow louder, a steady, pulsing heartbeat that matched his own. He surrendered to the darkness, knowing that as long as the river flowed, the silence of Wrightsville would never be truly empty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose pane of the kitchen window with a rhythmic clatter that sounded like bone on bone. Elias did not flinch. He was used to the house talking to him in the tongues of wood and wind. He reached for a heavy wool blanket draped over the back of his chair and pulled it tight around his shoulders, feeling the chill of the river finally beginning to seep out of his marrow. The dampness of the Susquehanna was not something you could simply wash off. It stayed in the pores, a permanent reminder of the threshold he walked every evening. He thought of the fish he had dropped into the black water. It was a small offering, a pittance really, but in the ancient logic of the river, it was a gesture of recognition. The creature did not need his charity, but it seemed to acknowledge the witness. That was the core of it, Elias realized as he stared into the dying embers of the hearth. Most people spent their lives trying to be seen by other people, but there was a different kind of soul that needed to be seen by the wilderness. To be known by something that did not have a name for you was a heavy, terrifying grace. His thoughts drifted back to the piece of bone on the side table. He knew Miller would never speak of it again, or if he did, it would be as a joke told over a third beer to make himself feel larger than the shadows. That was how the world handled the inexplicable. They laughed at it until it felt small enough to ignore. But Elias knew the truth was much heavier. The truth was that the Safe Harbor Dam, for all its concrete and steel, was a temporary scab on a wound that had been bleeding for 10,000 years. The river was patient. It had seen the mountains rise and would see them ground back into dust. He stood up one last time to bolt the door, not out of fear of what lived in the water, but out of a habit of closure. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the door, seeing a man who was becoming more like the driftwood he gathered every spring. He was gray, weathered, and held together by a stubborn, fibrous will. He turned off the single porch light, plunging the front of the house into the same velvet blackness that swallowed the pier. The distant roar of the water over the rocks at the falls hummed through the floorboards, a low-frequency vibration that acted as a lullaby for a man who had no one left to talk to. Elias climbed the narrow stairs to his bedroom, his boots heavy on the wood. He didn't need to look out the upstairs window to know the fog had completely reclaimed the valley. He knew the river was out there, breathing in the mud, moving through the deep trenches where the light of the sun had never reached. He lay down in the dark, his breath evening out as the house grew still. In the silence of the York County hills, the only thing that moved was the water, carving its way through the stone and the centuries. Elias closed his eyes and let the sound of the Susquehanna fill his mind, a vast and wordless song that told of things hidden and things lost. He drifted into a dreamless sleep, anchored to the earth by the weight of the secrets he kept, while below the cliffs, the river continued its long, slow march toward the sea, carrying the memory of a man and a silver fish into the heart of the mist. The first light of dawn did not break the fog so much as it turned the world into a bruised, translucent purple. Elias woke before the sun, his body moving with the stiff, mechanical precision of a clock that had seen too many winters. He did not linger in the warmth of his bed but instead walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. The river was still there, a flat expanse of leaden gray that seemed to have absorbed the very soul of the night. It was higher than it had been the evening before, the spring melt from upriver finally reaching the narrow gaps of Wrightsville. He dressed in his oilskins, the fabric crinkling like dried parchment in the quiet room. There was a finality in his movements today, a sense that the vigil he had kept for decades was reaching a natural conclusion. He did not make coffee or light the stove. He simply picked up his walking stick, a piece of hickory smoothed by 1,000 miles of shoreline, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick enough to taste, a mixture of wet stone and decaying vegetation that felt like the breath of the earth itself. He walked down the gravel path, his boots crunching rhythmically until he reached the edge of the bank. The pier where he had stood with Miller was now partially submerged, the tea-colored water swirling around the pilings in hungry, violent eddies. The Susquehanna was waking up, shedding its winter lethargy and reclaiming the lowlands. Elias stood at the very lip of the mud, his eyes scanning the surface for that familiar, heavy wake. It did not take long. Near the center of the river, where the current was strongest, a dark shape broke the surface. It was not a glimpse this time, it was a steady, deliberate presence. The creature moved toward the shore, cutting through the chop with a power that made the rushing river look fragile. It stopped 10 yards from where Elias stood, its head rising high enough for the water to cascade off its slate-colored shoulders. It remained perfectly still, its vast, dark eyes locked onto the old man. Elias felt no fear, only a profound sense of recognition. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of etched bone he had carried for years. He looked at it one last time, tracing the deep grooves with his thumb, and then he tossed it into the water. The bone sank instantly, disappearing into the silt. The creature let out a low, huffing breath, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up into the soles of Elias's boots. It was a goodbye, a closing of a ledger that had been open since before his grandfather was born. The creature dipped its head and dived, its long, powerful tail rising once more to slap the surface with the force of a falling tree. The sound echoed off the hills of York County, a thunderous crack that signaled the end of the encounter. Elias watched the ripples spread until they were swallowed by the larger current, and then he turned his back on the water. He walked up the hill toward his house, not stopping to look over his shoulder, feeling the weight of the secret finally lift from his heart. He reached his porch and sat in the old wooden chair, watching the sun finally begin to burn through the mist. The river would continue to flow, the town would continue to grow, and people like Miller would continue to believe only in what they could measure. But the Susquehanna would keep its shadows, and the one who breathes in the mud would remain, a silent guardian of the deep trenches. Elias closed his eyes and let the warmth of the morning sun touch his face, listening to the river's eternal murmur until it became the only sound in the world. He was a part of the water now, a ghost on the bank of a story that had finally reached its end.